The sky over France was a brilliant cold blue that morning. April 8th, 1943. At 27,000 feet, the air is thin and pure, and the world below is just a map of greens and browns. Through the canopy of my Focke-Wulf 190, everything was crystal clear. Especially the targets. I remember smirking. The oxygen mask couldn't hide it. Below us, these silhouettes were climbing toward our formation. They were clumsy, labored, nothing like the Spitfires we were used to fighting. These were new. The Americans had finally arrived. I keyed my transmitter, looking over at my wingman. "Fritz," I said, unable to keep the laughter out of my voice. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles." And they looked it. Massive, barrel-shaped things. Republic P47 Thunderbolts. We learned the name later. They weighed 7 tons. 7. Our Focke-Wulfs were athletes, nimble and sleek. These things were corpulent. Their wings seemed too small for their huge bodies. We circled above them like wolves, watching them struggle for altitude, their big engines straining. We were veterans of Poland, of France, of the skies over Britain and Russia. They had been in combat for exactly 0 days. This, we thought, would be easy. It was in those first weeks of April and May. We proved ourselves right. The P-47 couldn't turn with a 1-90. It couldn't climb with a Messerschmitt. We developed tactics quickly. Attack them from below where their weight made them struggle. Force them into a turning fight where our agility would leave them helpless. My commander, the great ace Josef Pips Priller, sent a report back to headquarters. I remember reading it. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter," he wrote. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indians. Fat targets pretending to be warriors." The statistics backed us up. In their first month, they lost 14 Thunderbolts. We lost 3. The British, in their elegant Spitfires, quietly suggested the Americans had made a terrible mistake. We agreed. We laughed. But there was something odd. Something we noticed but didn't understand. The P-47s we did shoot down. They didn't want to die. A Messerschmitt, you hit the coolant line, the engine seizes, it's over. A Spitfire, you put a few cannon shells into the wing root, it comes apart. But these Thunderbolts, they absorbed incredible punishment. I remember one mission in May. I put a long burst into one from 200 meters. I saw my shells hitting all over the fuselage, the engine. Black smoke poured out. Any other plane would have been a falling torch. This one just kept flying. It shuddered, it slowed, but it stayed in the air. We heard a report from an English listening post later. A P-47 had returned to its base with over 100 machine gun strikes and 20 cannon holes in it. We dismissed it. Propaganda. A fluke. No single plane could survive that. We were wrong. We just didn't know how wrong yet. The laughter, you see, was still too loud to hear the truth. The lesson began on June 26th. I wasn't there that day, but the story spread through the Luftwaffe like a fever. It involved an American pilot, a second lieutenant Robert Johnson. His formation of 48 Thunderbolts was returning from an escort mission when they were bounced by Wilhelm Galland's group. A perfect attack. Diving from the sun. Johnson's plane was at the rear. It was caught in a crossfire. It took catastrophic damage. Cannon shells exploded across the aircraft. The canopy shattered. The engine cowling was torn away. Fire erupted in the cockpit. Johnson was wounded, trapped. A shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. He was in a flying coffin, but the coffin wouldn't fall. Battered, on fire, with an engine that shook the teeth out of his head, he somehow leveled off and pointed the wreck toward England. That's when it got worse. One of our pilots, a young man from JG-26, found the crippled Thunderbolt limping home. It was a mercy killing. He positioned himself behind Johnson and opened fire. He emptied his cannons into it, every last round. Still it flew. The pilot pulled alongside, staring. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This flying pile of wreckage refused to die. He repositioned and emptied his machine guns into it too. And still, it flew. Our pilot pulled alongside again. He looked at the American, trapped in his shattered cockpit. He shook his head in amazement, gave a sort of salute, and peeled away. He was out of ammunition. Johnson landed that plane at Manston. The ground crew stopped counting the bullet holes after 200. 3 of the 4 main structural beams of the fuselage were shot through. One cannon shell had exploded inches from his head. The plane had brought him home. When we heard this story, we didn't believe it. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment, but the combat reports from our own pilots confirmed it. It was impossible, but it had happened. The laughter in our mess halls started to fade. This flying milk bottle was something else entirely. It was a juggernaut. And then, the Americans stopped fighting our fight. They learned. Their commanders, men like Hubert Zemke, they figured it out. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them. Use your weight. Use your power. I remember the first time I truly understood. We were climbing to intercept bombers and we saw them above us, far above, 30,000 feet, maybe higher. Instead of engaging us, they rolled over and dived. You cannot imagine the speed. Nothing could catch them. They came down like hammers from heaven. You couldn't get a shot. By the time you reacted, they were already past you, converting that incredible speed back into altitude in a zoom climb that left us gasping in the thin air. And at the bottom of these dives, their guns would speak. We had cannons, powerful, destructive, but with limited ammunition. They had 8 heavy machine guns. It doesn't sound as impressive, does it? It was 1,000 times worse. It wasn't a series of punches. It was a flood, a solid wall of lead. My wingman Klaus was on my right. A flight of 4 Thunderbolts dove on us. I screamed a warning. Klaus broke right. One of the Americans followed him. He didn't fire in short bursts, he just held the trigger down for maybe 2 seconds. Klaus's Focke-Wulf didn't catch fire. It didn't trail smoke, it simply came apart. The wings separated from the fuselage, the tail shredded into metal confetti. One moment there was an aircraft, the next a cloud of burning debris. They had sawn it in half. That was when the fear started. It wasn't the fear of being outfought, it was the fear of being erased, annihilated. Then came the death of Hans Philipp, a hero, over 200 victories, one of our best. On October 8th, he led his group against bombers over Bremen. They were at 28,000 feet. At that altitude, our engines were gasping for air. Our controls felt sluggish. We were at our limit. But the Americans, they were just getting started. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharger meant it performed better up there. P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group dove on Phillips formation from 32,000 feet, from their own hunting ground. Robert Johnson, the same pilot who had survived the impossible, was there. He saw Phillips' distinctive aircraft. His combat report was cold, clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. Hans Philipp, gone. If he couldn't survive against them, what chance did we have? The sky was no longer ours. Not at high altitude. The Americans owned the stratosphere. In early 1944, a new variant arrived, the P47D. It had a new propeller, massive paddle blades. It changed everything. Suddenly, the fat American fighters could climb. I remember bouncing a formation near Hanover. We expected our usual advantage. We dived, they saw us, and they turned into us and climbed with us. We were shocked. We tried to disengage by climbing away, our old trick. They followed us right up to 30,000 feet. My friend Schmidt was caught. He was blown apart, just smoke and fragments. These were not the machines we laughed at last year. They had a new sound too, a deep thundering roar that you could hear from miles away. The blade tips were going supersonic. We started calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. It was the sound of death approaching. As the invasion of France grew near, the Mustangs, the P-51s, began to take over the long-range escort missions. We thought this might be a relief. We were fools. It only freed the Thunderbolts to do what they were truly born for, to kill everything on the ground. They became Jabos, Jagged Bomber. But they were more than that. They were flying artillery. They carried bombs, rockets. I saw it myself. I was flying cover for a retreating panzer column. 4 P-47s appeared. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming. Then the hammer of those 8 machine guns. A column of our trucks and half-tracks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles became a string of fireballs in a single pass. The psychological effect was devastating. Then came June 6th, 1944. D-Day. I was ordered to fly a sortie to the beaches at dawn. 12 fighters from my group took off. We found an impenetrable umbrella of Thunderbolts over the landing zones. They were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. It was a wall. You couldn't climb over them. You couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. I was the only one to return from my group. The sky belonged to them, completely. The final, crushing truth came on New Year's Day, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte. A last, desperate gamble to destroy Allied air power on the ground. Nearly 900 of us, all that was left of the Luftwaffe's best, in a surprise attack. We hit an airfield near Metz, Y-34. It was home to a P47 group. We achieved complete surprise. We destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground. They captured one of our pilots. He was brought before the American commander, a Major Brooking. Our pilot, full of arrogance from the successful attack, pointed to the burning flight line. "What do you think of that?" he taunted. The American major didn't get angry. He just pointed to the end of the runway, where ground crews were already clearing the wreckage. He said, "By tomorrow we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk vanished, and that was it. That was the moment the war was truly lost. It wasn't a fight against pilots and planes anymore. It was a fight against a factory, an assembly line, an avalanche of steel that we could not stop. Within 2 days, their flight line was full of brand new P-47s flown in from depots in England. We lost over 200 pilots that day. Men we could never replace. My last combat mission was in April 1945. There were 6 of us, flying planes that barely had enough fuel for an hour. We were children, most of us. We encountered 4 Thunderbolts over Leipzig. The fight lasted 12 seconds. I saw them diving. I screamed to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My Messerschmitt shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded. I barely escaped in my parachute. As I floated down, I watched them destroy my entire staffel. 6 fighters, gone in under a minute. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies. We called it Jabo fever. Veteran pilots who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without a flicker of fear would become physically ill before a mission where Thunderbolts were expected. The sound, that Donnerschlag, it meant your time was up. After the war, in a prison camp, I had time to think. We all did. I remembered my old commander, Pips Priller, the same man who called them pregnant cows. In 1945, he was interviewed. He said the Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented, but beyond the machine is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1. It's gone forever. Years later, I read that our great general, Adolf Galland, flew a captured P-47. He said that when he flew it, he finally understood. The Americans hadn't tried to build a better version of our fighters. They built an American one, designed for production, for firepower, and for survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take the punishment and deliver a devastating blow would win. We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter, and we laughed. We thought we were knights of the air, artists of single combat. We were the ones who didn't understand. They didn't build a dueling rapier, they built a sledgehammer. They didn't come to outfly us, they came to destroy us. The laughter died with our comrades. All that is left, even now, is the memory of that sound. The sound of Roosevelt's piano, we called it. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable. The sound of an avalanche of lead. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America. Hanging in that parachute, the silence was the worst part. After the explosion of my Messerschmitt, the roar of battle, the shriek of tearing metal, there was nothing, just the wind. For a moment it was peaceful. Then the sound came back to me. Not the familiar roar of my own engine, but the receding thunder of theirs. The Donnerschlag, fading as they sought new targets. Below me I could see the funeral pyres of my staffel. 6 thin columns of black smoke rising from the German countryside. 6 funerals in the sky, all in under a minute. I, the hunter, had become a spectator to my own squadron's extinction. As I drifted down, I was no longer an ace. I was no longer a pilot. I was just a man about to fall into a war we had already lost. The next few weeks I was not in the sky. I was on the ground, a foot soldier in the chaos of a collapsing front. And it was there in the mud and the fear that I learned the final, most brutal lesson of the Thunderbolt. To see it from the air, hunting, is one thing. To be the one it is hunting, that is something else entirely. I remember hiding in a ditch with a group of young grenadiers. boys, really. We heard it before we saw it. That deep, gut-rumbling roar. It didn't sound like an aircraft engine. It sounded like the world was being torn open. A corporal next to me, a veteran of Stalingrad, started to shake. "Jabos," he whispered, his face pale. They came over the tree line, 4 of them, flying so low their shadows raced ahead of them like specters. They weren't moving like aircraft. They were too solid, too heavy. They moved like projectiles fired from some colossal gun. I was no longer a hunter. I was prey. I pressed my face into the dirt and prayed to a god I had long forgotten. The first one fired. It wasn't the staccato bark of a single cannon. It was a continuous, deafening roar, like a giant tearing a sheet of metal in two, an industrial buzzsaw. I saw the dirt in front of our ditch erupt in a line of geysers, not puffs of dust, geysers of earth and steel. A supply truck 50 meters away simply vaporized. It didn't explode. One moment it was there, the next it was a cloud of burning confetti. The sound of those 850 caliber guns hitting steel is a sound you feel in your bones. It is the sound of total disintegration. When they were gone, the silence they left behind was filled with the screams of the wounded. The young corporal who had survived Stalingrad was dead. He hadn't been hit directly. A single half-inch round had passed through the thick oak tree he was hiding behind and killed him instantly. We had believed we were fighting pilots. We were wrong. We were fighting a machine that made the man inside almost incidental. He didn't have to be a crack shot. He just had to point that flying shotgun in the general direction and pull the trigger. The mathematics of destruction did the rest. Soon after, I was captured. In the prison camp, there were pilots from every front. We talked. We had nothing else to do. We argued. We tried to understand how it had all gone so wrong. I remember talking to Kurt, an old friend who had over 100 victories on the Eastern Front. He had fought against the Soviets for 3 years. He was tough, cynical, and afraid of nothing. But he was haunted by his brief time on the Western Front. He told me, "Ralph, the Russians, they were hard. They came in waves. You shot one down, 2 more took his place. They tried to overwhelm you with men. The Americans, they overwhelm you with the machine. On the Ostfront, if your cannon jammed, you could still fight. You could outfly them. A dogfight was a duel. Against the Thunderbolt, it was not a duel, it was an execution. Their guns never jammed. Their engines never quit. Their planes came home with half a wing missing. It was a different kind of war. A war of systems, not of heroes." He was right. We had obsessed over the experten, the aces. Men like Marseille, Hartmann, Galland. Our entire philosophy was built around the brilliant individual. The Americans built their philosophy around the brilliant machine, flown by a competent, well-trained professional. They didn't need every pilot to be an ace. They just needed thousands of them who could fly to 30,000 feet, point the nose down, and hold the trigger. Our way was romantic. Theirs was brutally effective. Decades passed. The world changed. I became an old man. In 1985, I was invited to a reunion in Phoenix, Arizona. German and American pilots. We met not as enemies, but as survivors of a shared history. It was strange, shaking hands with men I had tried to kill and who had tried to kill me. One evening, I found myself talking to a quiet man named Frank. He was a grandfather from Ohio who sold insurance. In 1944, he had flown P47s with the 56th Fighter Group. He was one of the men who had been above us, one of the hammers from heaven. We talked for a while about our lives, our families. Then I had to ask, the question that had sat in my mind for 40 years. "Frank," I said, my voice quiet, Did you know? Did you have any idea how much we feared you? Not your Mustangs, not your Spitfires, your Thunderbolts." He looked at me, and he didn't smile or boast. His expression was serious, thoughtful. "We knew they were tough planes," he said slowly. "Our ground crews used to joke they could patch the holes with chewing gum and send us back up. As for fear, mostly we were just scared of the flak and of getting lost. The flying part was, well, it was a job. You climbed, you watched the bombers, and if you saw a bandit, you did what you were trained to do." "And the guns?" I pressed. "That incredible firepower?" He nodded. "They told us not to think of it as shooting. They said you don't fly it, you aim it. We aimed the whole airplane. The instructor said, get within 400 yards, fill your gun sight, and hold the trigger down for 2 seconds. Don't worry about hitting a specific spot. Just put the cone of fire on him. The plane will do the rest. It usually did. And that was it. That was the answer. For us, it was a clash of souls, a test of will and skill. For him, it was a procedure, a technical problem to be solved with the correct application of a tool with 8 barrels and 3,400 rounds of ammunition. He held no malice. He was just a man from Ohio who had been given the world's most effective sledgehammer and told where to swing it. I look back now at that clear blue sky in April 1943. I see myself, a young man full of arrogance and pride, smirking at those clumsy flying milk bottles. I was a knight, I thought, in a thoroughbred steed. What I didn't realize was that the age of knights was over. The age of industry had arrived. The P47 wasn't just an airplane, it was a prophecy, a symbol of a new kind of power, a power that didn't rely on the brilliance of a few, but on the relentless, overwhelming output of the many. We laughed at them, and they buried us. Not with hatred, not with superior courage, but with rivets, with steel, with hydraulics, and with an endless stream of 50 caliber bullets. They buried us under the sheer, undeniable weight of a factory floor. The milk bottle, it turned out, was full of thunder, and it drowned us all. I asked Frank one more thing that night in Phoenix, a question that had always puzzled me. I asked him about confirming his victories. For us, a victory was a personal declaration, backed by a wingman's testimony. It was a matter of honor. Frank just shrugged. The film told the story, he said. Every time we fired the guns, a camera in the wing started rolling. When we got back, they'd develop it. If the film showed lethal hits, you got credit. If it didn't, you didn't. Simple as that. Simple as that. I was stunned. It was another piece of the puzzle, another layer of their industrial logic. For them, combat was not just a fight. It was data to be collected, analyzed, and filed. Our victories were tales of daring told in the mess hall over schnapps. Theirs were entries in a ledger, confirmed by a machine. We were fighting a war of sagas. They were fighting a war of statistics. And their numbers were always bigger than ours. What was it like, I asked him, changing the subject. To fly? To sit in it for hours? He thought for a moment. Roomy, he said finally. You could stretch your legs, unstrap and run around the cockpit, the British joked, but it was comfortable. On a long escort, you could almost relax. The controls were heavy, but smooth. It felt solid, dependable, like a good American car. I could only shake my head. In my Messerschmitt, I didn't sit. I wore the cockpit like a steel glove. My elbows touched the sides. My head was inches from the canopy. We were melded with our machines. Every vibration, every shudder felt through our bones. We were part of the aircraft. The Americans, I realized, were not part of the machine. They were its operator. Sitting in a comfortable chair, managing a complex and deadly system designed to keep them safe while it did its work. Even their design philosophy reflected it. One was a weapon for a warrior. The other was a workstation for a technician. Years after that reunion, I visited the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, and there it was. A P-47D restored to perfection, sitting under the soft lights. It was bigger, more brutal up close than I ever remembered seeing it in the sky. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't beautiful, it was pure function. I walked up to it, reached out a hand, and touched the leading edge of that massive wing. The metal was cold and impassive. I saw the ports for the 8 guns grouped in the wings, not elegant cannons hidden behind panels, but 8 black, unblinking eyes staring out. I could almost hear that sound again, that terrifying buzzsaw roar. I looked at the engine, that huge radial. Not a sleek, liquid-cooled engine like ours, engineered for aerodynamic perfection, but a brute. An industrial furnace with cylinders sticking out, designed for power and the ability to absorb incredible damage. One of our mechanics had once told me that the American radial engine was proof they didn't understand airflow. He was wrong. It was proof they understood war. A single piece of shrapnel in our coolant system meant a dead engine. That R-2800 could have a cylinder shot clean off, and it would still drag the pilot home. Standing there, in the quiet of the museum, I finally understood. The Thunderbolt was not a thing of malice. It was not a monster. It was a tool, forged in a furnace of production we could not even imagine. It was the physical manifestation of a country that could build highways through mountains and dam great rivers. A country that solved problems not with elegance, but with overwhelming force. I thought back to that young man, the Oberleutnant smirking in his cockpit, so certain of his superiority, of his skill, of his fine German machine. I saw him for what he was, a foolish boy laughing at the tide coming in. He didn't know he was facing more than just an airplane. He was facing a philosophy. He was facing a force of nature. The plaque beside the aircraft listed its statistics, its speed, its weight, its armament, but it was missing the most important one, the one that truly mattered, the number of factories that built it, the number of ships that carried it, the number of pilots trained to fly it. The P47 wasn't just a weapon, it was the verdict. The final word in an argument we had already lost before the first shot was ever fired. I stepped away from the Thunderbolt and looked around the museum hall at the other aircraft. Our Messerschmitt 109 was there, a grey shark forever frozen in its element. The Spitfire, a thing of true beauty, an artist's creation. They were predators, designed for the kill. But the P47, it was not a predator, it was an exterminator. It was designed not for the hunt, but for the harvest. And the men who flew them, Frank, the insurance salesman from Ohio. I met others that weekend, a farmer from Iowa, a high school teacher from California. They spoke of the war not as a crusade, but as a dirty, necessary job they had to finish so they could go home. We saw ourselves as the inheritors of a warrior tradition, the legacy of Richthofen. We had our rituals, our code of chivalry, our obsession with personal victory counts. The Americans had checklists. They had flight manuals thick as Bibles that detailed every possible emergency. They had a supply chain that delivered spare parts, fresh food, and Coca-Cola to the front lines with the same relentless efficiency. I remember in the winter of '44, my squadron was grounded for 2 weeks. Not because of the weather, but because we had no hydraulic fluid for the landing gear. 2 weeks. At that same time, I learned later, the 9th Air Force was receiving so many spare engines, they were using the empty crates to build their field offices. We were fighting for our lives with what we had. They were fighting with what they could make, and they could make everything. The P47 was just the most visible part of it. Behind every Thunderbolt in the sky, there was a shadow on the ground, a factory in Farmingdale, a steel mill in Pittsburgh, an oil refinery in Texas, a pilot training school in Arizona. We were not just fighting the 365th Fighter Group. We were fighting the Ford Motor Company. We were fighting General Electric. We were fighting the United States itself and its bottomless capacity produce. There was a phrase we had in the final months, a piece of gallows humor. When one of our pilots would claim a victory, another would say, "Good, now they will only send 2 to your funeral." We knew. Deep down, we knew. Every loss for us was a wound that would not heal. Every loss for them was a line item on a production schedule, already replaced before the smoke had cleared. This knowledge, it rots the soul. It makes courage feel pointless. What is the bravery of one man against an assembly line in the sky? I saw this erosion of spirit in my friends. I saw it in the eyes of the new pilots, the children sent up with barely 100 hours of flight time. They were not being sent to fight. They were being sent to die, to buy a few more hours, a few more days, for a cause that was already lost. They knew it. They feared the engine failure, the lack of fuel, as much as they feared the enemy. Their own machines were betraying them. And the American machines, they were relentless. They never betrayed their pilots. A few years ago, I read a maintenance report from a P47 group in 1944. An aircraft had returned with flak damage. The report was clinical. Repaired 142 holes in fuselage and wings. Replaced 3 engine cylinders. Replaced starboard elevator. Aircraft returned to service in 36 hours. 36 hours. That aircraft would have been a monument of scrap metal in our junkyards. For them, it was just another repair job. Their victory was not won in the air, in the turning dogfights we romanticized. It was won in the hangars, in the supply depots, in the factories thousands of miles away. It was a victory of maintenance crews and logistics officers, a victory of wrenches and screwdrivers. My war did not end with a final dramatic dogfight. It ended with a quiet surrender in a muddy field. A few weeks later, I was in a prisoner column, marching through what was left of a German town. We were tired, we were hungry, and we were defeated. And I heard a sound. The familiar drone of a radial engine. I flinched. Everyone did. We looked to the sky, our bodies tensing for the hammer blow of the Jabos. But it wasn't a Thunderbolt. It was a C-47, a transport plane flying low and slow. The sound was similar, the same family of engine, but it was different. It wasn't the sound of a warrior. It was the sound of a worker. As it passed overhead, the rear doors opened and canvas sacks tumbled out, falling into a nearby field. Food, medicine. I stood there watching that plane disappear, and I understood the totality of our defeat. The same industrial power that had built the machines to destroy us was now using its other machines to feed us. They had not just conquered our skies, they had inherited them. The sound of that engine was no longer the sound of death. It was the sound of the new world. A world that belonged to them. I think of that young Oberleutnant in 1943, full of laughter. The laughter was a symptom of our blindness. We saw a clumsy airplane, and we missed the system that created it. We saw a fat fuselage, and we missed the industrial heartland behind it. We saw an enemy pilot, and we missed the nation that armed him with an indestructible shield and an inexhaustible sword. The laughter died. And in the silence that followed, we finally understood. We had been fighting an airplane. They had been fighting with a country. And a country is a much harder thing to shoot down. It's a strange thing to look at the instrument of your destruction and feel not hatred, but a kind of awe. Awe at the sheer scale of it all. We Germans prided ourselves on our engineering, the intricate clockwork of our machines, the genius of our designers like Messerschmitt and Tank. We believed we were creating masterpieces. But the Americans, they weren't building masterpieces. They were building hammers. And when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. We were the nail. We did have one last masterpiece, though. One final, desperate flash of genius. The Messerschmitt 262. The jet. I only saw one in combat once. I was on the ground near an airfield, watching a flight of our Focke-Wulfs struggle to take off. Suddenly, something crossed the field. There was no propeller, no roar of a piston engine, just a strange, high-pitched whistle like a devil's whisper. It moved at a speed that seemed impossible, like it was breaking the laws of physics. It was a shark among minnows. It made even the Thunderbolt look agricultural. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was hope. A terrible, foolish hope. We thought, this is the answer. This is the technology that will save us. Here was a machine that the P47 could not dive with, could not catch, could not fight. For a few weeks, the stories in the mess halls changed. We spoke of the jets, the Sturmvogel, the Stormbird. Maybe our brilliance could defeat their brute force after all. But it was a ghost. A beautiful, brilliant ghost. We could produce a handful. We had no fuel for them. The pilots trained to fly them were so few, their loss was a catastrophe. The P-47s and Mustangs didn't fight the jets in the sky. They destroyed them on the ground. They cratered the runways they needed for their long takeoff runs. They shot them down as they tried to land, slow and vulnerable. The American hammer, it turned out, was very good at smashing ghosts. The 262 was a glimpse of the future, but it arrived in a present that was already owned by our enemy. It was a brilliant answer to a question the war was no longer asking. The real question was not who could build the most advanced fighter. The question was who could sustain the fight. The Thunderbolt was the answer to that. It was not a weapon for a short, glorious war of nights. It was a weapon for a long, grinding war of factories. A war we were never equipped to fight. The war we lost. So I stand here, an old man in a quiet museum, looking at this relic of a bygone age. It is a symbol of my defeat. But it is also a symbol of a profound truth. That in modern war, it is not the sharpest sword that wins. It is the heaviest forge. The laughter of 1943 was the laughter of ignorance. The silence of 1945 was the silence of understanding. The thunder had spoken its last. The sky was quiet. But the story of that thunder did not end when our guns fell silent. Its roar echoed into a new, uncertain age. As our Reich crumbled, the true prize of the war was not land or gold, but knowledge. Our jet engines, our rocket scientists, our aerodynamic data, they were not destroyed. They were acquired. What I, and the rest of the world, did not know was that while we were fighting for our lives against their endless waves of piston engine fighters, American engineers in the secrecy of their own deserts were already taking the next step. They had seen our ghosts, our jets, and they were not just learning from them, they were improving upon them. The P47 Thunderbolt had perfected one kind of war, but its own creators were already working to make it obsolete. The lessons of its ruggedness, its firepower, and the overwhelming power of its engine were not forgotten. They were being translated into a new language, the language of the jet. The lessons learned in the skies over Europe would form the bedrock of a new generation of American fighters, built for a new kind of war, a colder war, fought in the shadows and on the edge of the sound barrier. The fat, clumsy milk bottle we once mocked had a child, and that child was a saber. In the years after the surrender, we lived in a world of ghosts. The ghosts of our fallen comrades, the ghosts of our cities, the ghost of our nation. I was a civilian again, working to rebuild, to forget. But you cannot forget the sky. Every time I looked up, I saw the ghosts of contrails. I heard the echoes of engines. Then a new sound began to fill the air over Germany. It wasn't the angry roar of a piston engine, it was something else, a clean, powerful hiss, the sound of jets. But these were not our desperate whistling Me-262s. These were American F-80 shooting stars, British vampires. They flew in perfect, confident formations over our ruined country. They were a constant reminder of who had won and of the new power that ruled the world. They were not a threat. They were a statement. I paid little attention to military matters. It was a life I had left behind. But in 1950, a new name started to appear in the newspapers. Korea. A war in a place most of us could not find on a map. And with it, new names for aircraft. The MiG-15. I saw the first drawings of it in a magazine. The swept wings, the high tail. I felt a strange, cold flicker of recognition. It was our design. The research from our wind tunnels, the work of our engineers, taken by the Soviets and perfected. It was fast, it climbed like a rocket, and it was armed with powerful cannons. It was a true thoroughbred. The reports said it was sweeping the Americans from the sky. For a moment, a dark, shameful part of me felt a grim satisfaction. So the Americans had finally met their match. Their industrial might was being beaten by superior design, the old argument. Then came the American response. Another name in the papers, the F-86 Sabre. I looked at the photographs. It had swept wings too, another child of our research. But when I read the details, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was not the fastest jet. The MiG could outclimb it. In some ways, on paper, it seemed the inferior machine, just like the Thunderbolt had seemed inferior to our Focke-Wulf. But then I read about its armament, 6 50 caliber machine guns. 6. In the age of the jet, in an era of cannon-armed fighters, the Americans had stayed with Roosevelt's piano. And I knew, in that moment, I knew exactly what was going to happen. They had not changed the lesson. They had simply applied it to a new technology. They understood something we never did. A cannon is a scalpel. It requires a surgeon to wield it effectively. A battery of heavy machine guns is a chainsaw. It just requires a strong man to point it in the right direction. I read the pilot reports smuggled out of the war zone. The Sabre pilots spoke of their aircraft with the same language the Thunderbolt pilots had used. It was tough. It could take a beating and bring you home. The cockpit was comfortable, the controls responsive. It was a stable gun platform. It was a pilot's aircraft designed to forgive mistakes and to be easy to fly well. The MiG, like our Messerschmitt, was a demanding master. It could perform miracles in the hands of an expert, but it was unforgiving of the novice. The Americans were not sending experts. They were sending thousands of well-trained, competent pilots and giving them a machine designed to make them lethal. The same formula, the same industrial logic. The result was inevitable. Sabre pilots began to dominate the skies over Korea, not because their plane was necessarily better in a one-on-one duel, but because their weapon system was superior. The combination of the pilot, the plane, the guns, the radar gun sight, and the training, it was the Thunderbolt philosophy, reborn at 600 miles per hour. I realized then that the P-47's true legacy was not the number of tanks it destroyed or planes it shot down. Its legacy was a doctrine, a blueprint for victory. It taught the Americans that a good enough machine, produced in overwhelming numbers, rugged and reliable, armed with a torrent of firepower, and flown by well-trained ordinary men, could defeat a smaller force of superior machines flown by irreplaceable experts. That is the ghost that truly haunts the history of aerial warfare. Not the aces, not the legendary dogfights. It is the ghost of a 7-ton fighter we laughed at. A fighter that taught a nation how to win, and they have been using that blueprint ever since. The fat milk bottle from 1943 cast a very, very long shadow, and in that shadow new wars would be fought, and new thunder would be heard in skies all over the world. If you want to discover how the end of one war became the beginning of another, and how the industrial might that built the Thunderbolt was unleashed to create the super fighters of the jet age, then make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel. The battle for the skies was far from over. It was just getting started. To be continued.